Good morning, everyone. Hopefully you guys can hear me okay. Happy Easter. Happy everyone's here this morning. Glad to see people in person. I think I'm the only presenter here in person, but I made my way from Hays, Kansas, just for you guys. So I was going to stop and get some candy and some Easter eggs and all the good stuff, but was running a little behind this morning. So anyway, this is my first year being here, so I know last year we had COVID, and then this is my first year in person, and I'll kind of show my territory here in a minute, what I cover. But when Jonathan first reached out to me about coming out here to speak, he kind of gave me the rundown of, we want to talk about fire prevention, we want to talk about rangeland, noxious weeds. And so when I was thinking about, I kind of try to edit each of my presentations to see what my audience, what they want to hear about. And so when I was thinking about it, I think to encompass everything I want to talk about, the key thing I can take away is Rangeland Health. If we look around, we're driving down the roads. When I'm traveling from Hays, Kansas to Colorado, I look around and our land looks sick. And we are here to help get it back healthy again. And I don't think there's a one-stop shop that's going to have a cure for everything, but there are ways and methods that we can help have a prescription for our land. So a little bit about myself. You'll see my territory up here. I cover everything west of Russell, Kansas, western Kansas, western Nebraska, about everything west of North Platte, and then also the whole state of Colorado. So with that, all of Nebraska actually used to be a territory, and all of Kansas used to be a territory. And I believe you can see here in the blue the fine line from where it rains and where it doesn't. So they gave me the territory of where what would be encompassed as western rangeland, very similar climate, very similar rainfall. And so I believe that this actually makes the most sense when we split those states in half. I'm originally from Missouri, so I come from green grass, the land of green grass and trees, which is kind of not out here at the moment. But so this is kind of like a culture shock for me moving out here, and then now that I live in Hays, Kansas. And so fire is new to me. I had never experienced a wildfire. Our wildfire back home is we'd be clearing brush and fence lines, and maybe a fire got out of control and we had to, call the local fire department to come help put it out. But so moving out here, I probably could learn more from you all on actual wildfires and prevention. But I do have a few tools here in the toolbox that I want to share with you that can help with our noxious weeds and how we can prevent those fires. So anyway, here's my contact information. Feel free to reach out to me at any time if anyone has any questions. I'm more than happy to answer. So the first thing I wanted to address is, what is Rangeland Health? So Aldo Leopold, many have recognized him as the father of wildlife ecology. His quote is, "Rangeland viewed in its entirety is the slow and laborious unfolding of a new relationship between people and land." And I don't think I could say it in much better than that. And so in this picture, we have a healthy rangeland. We have forbs, we have flowers, pollinators, we have green grass, we have shrubs. This is what I would consider a healthy rangeland landscape. And this was taken out of Idaho. So getting into a little bit more of the meat and potatoes and more of the definitions behind Rangeland Health, describes the ecological status of rangeland. So we can go out and we can look at our rangelands and we can decide, are there noxious weeds? What are the level of noxious weeds? What's the invasive weeds? Are there pollinators that are also noxious weeds? We have those as well. And then the rangeland landscape and its resources are constantly being modified by a suite of non-human forces, including fire, which one we're going to talk about, climate and weather, and grazing. Now, over the last 100 years, those non-human forces are still there, but we also have a new force that's coming into play, which is humans and how they're modifying rangelands. You all live in Colorado. I would say Colorado at the moment is a desirable state to live in. So there's a lot of people moving into Colorado, more homes being built, more development, more roads. And so there's a lot more that we have to take into consideration now with our rangelands and our landscapes than what we probably would have had to do 100 years ago. So you can see some of the modifying rangeland landscapes that we have through infrastructure. So removal of fire from our natural cycle results in many things. So we all know, historians have said that in the past, wildfires they occurred very often, every 5 to 10 years, and that was the natural life cycle. And I don't know, many of you, I grew up around horses, I rodeo, I was on the rodeo team at Oklahoma State, and I follow a few farms that are in the eastern Flint Hills of Kansas. And they posted the other day, babies are hitting the ground and the Flint Hills are on fire because ranchers practice every single year burning the Flint Hills still. Granted, they get more rainfall in eastern Kansas, but a lot of that is because of the ecological cycle that happened many years ago. And so as they redo that, they're using that method for many different reasons, getting rid of noxious weeds, and then they're also doing that practice as a preventative for future reference. So when we remove this natural life cycle, so here let's use Colorado for instance, we have more homes, we have more infrastructure where there would have probably been more natural fires. We have overcrowded stands, we get dense canopies which become shade tolerant, and then we begin to get less fire resistant species. Low burning surface fire turn into high intensity crown fire, which we've heard these terms on the last presentation, but I'm going to go over more of the definition behind those. Our recovery time from fire is directly related to our forest structure, which we'll talk about. And then the overcrowding leads to trees that are more susceptible to disease, insects, and other stresses. So a quote that I heard earlier is, once the flames are out, the fire, it's not over. So let's use the fires over on the western slope on 70. I was heading over to a barrel race over in Montrose, and we got stuck over there because where the fire had gone up one of the slopes, there was a mudslide. So even though the fire is out, the restoration, the management, it's not over. So we have to take that into consideration when we have these fires come through. So wildland fire behavior and its results, this is where I'm going to get into the forest layers. This relates more, again, to the forest than rather our rangeland aspect. But we have understory, midstory, and overstory. Those can also be termed as surface, ladder, and crown fuels. So just like they sound, surface fuels are your low, more rangeland landscape fuels, which are your grass, shrubs, litter, woody material on the ground. And then we go up a layer, so we're moving up horizontally or vertically, and our ladder fuels, those are your live and dead small trees and shrubs, lower branches of tall trees, and those are what are conductors then that move into our huge crown fire. So when we move vertically from the ground up, we have our surface, then that catches our ladder, then that catches our crown fuels. So those are suspended above the grounds, and those most times are your fastest moving and lead to your high intent, or you're usually your strongest and can cause the most destruction. Managing fuels across landscapes, so we need to manage more than just a few stands in a contiguous forest. A lot of these slides that I took were from we have a team of territory managers in California, and so they spend a lot of their time and their research on studying these fires and how can we prevent them. And so they've looked into the mosaic patterns of fuel management have reduced fires. The slope of forests greatly impact fire behavior. If we are on a steeper slope, as those fires start moving upward, the crowns keep going up, so that has a large impact on our fire behavior. Strategic treatment of fuels, so again, slope density, contiguous versus patches of fuels all affect fire behavior. Fuel breaks in strategic locations, ridge lines around communities. So I think what we just heard on the last presentation, those barriers between your homes, I would consider that a fire break. And then we can also go into the larger fire breaks that I'll show you here in a minute that we find out more in the forest and that are managed by our parks and wildlife. Fuel breaks, okay, in strategic locations, and then reduce the negative impacts of fire, benefit forest health, resulting in social and economic benefits. So this is a picture of a fuel break as a management tool. I believe this one was taken out of California as well. So as you can see here, this looks like a healthy fuel break. When we develop these fuel breaks, we just can't develop it and be done and walk away and say, okay, we're done. We don't have to worry about it anymore. We have to keep managing these fuel breaks, or we're just going to keep chasing our tail at that point. So it provides a need across for access for firefighters. This is an access point, and then this also can slow an advancing fire, giving precious time for both firefighting activities as well as evacuations. And as I mentioned, it's not enough to build or create a fuel break, but it must be maintained. I think the same is true for around your homes. We just heard that you need to remove debris, remove anything that can be flammable. We can't just do that once and be done. We have to maintain that. Fire breaks will tend to fill back in with brush if left alone, and maintenance is key to reducing ladder fuels. So I know I just talked a bunch about fire, but I also want to talk in Rangeland Health about the value of weed and brush control. I don't know if we have any ranchers on the phone or in the room, but the value of weed and brush control goes just beyond our fire prevention, but also into our carrying capacity for our cattle. So you can see on the left where we have before weed control, and then you can see on the right where we have after weed control. So we reduce our carrying capacity if we do not control weeds. We see more purchased feed required, and grazing your cattle on your landscape is your lowest cost feed source. As soon as you have to start putting out hay, as soon as you have to start supplementing with grain, you have to keep that out to keep up with those stocking rates. And then you can see on the right where if we manage those weeds, we see a grazing season is longer, which then reduces our input costs. So I want to look at this from an aerial view. So this was done with cattle, but I think the same is true for any wildlife. Wildlife and animals are going to take the path of least resistance. I think that's pretty evident. They're pretty simple animals. They're not going to try and make it harder than what it is. So you can see here, this is spotty patch grazing through a pretty weedy area. And so if we can remove all that, we're able to offer a more palatable landscape. So Corteva AgriScience, I didn't really introduce it at the beginning, but if you are familiar with Dow AgriSciences and DuPont, they did an equal merger of separate entities of their ag division. So Corteva AgriScience is the merger of Dow and DuPont, but it's a division solely focused, standalone company solely focused to agriculture. And so we take a lot of pride into going into this research and looking and seeing. So what did we do with all this research? We let the cattle vote on Rangeland Health and what it means to them. So this study was done actually in Missouri, and you can see we put collars on the cattle, and so what that does is it monitors how many times their heads are on the ground actively grazing. So you'll see here, I'm not sure if you can see it that well, but the yellow is where was treated versus untreated. So this was fixed points on the cattle before we treated. So what we're showing here, this was prior to application. So you can see it's pretty uniformed between here and here of where the cattle were actively grazing, and this was pre-application. So this is 3 months after application, and you can see that much of what was here has migrated over to here. So the cattle would much rather graze in the distributed area that was treated rather than untreated. And so if you are a cattle producer, if you do, the value of treating your pastures or your rangeland goes beyond what you see every day, but also who's the people out there that's actively grazing it. So today, that was just a kind of a brief overview to jump into. I want to talk about new technology. We've got some new technology coming out within Corteva, some new herbicides, and then how that plays into noxious weed control, which then gets us into what I just talked about, fire prevention, and then how we can increase our stocking and carrying capacities. And then we'll wrap up with any questions. So a new active ingredient, this isn't a standalone product, but a new active ingredient that Corteva AgriScience has brought into the herbicide market is Rinskor. And so Rinskor is the first new active ingredient introduced to the range and pasture market in 15 years. We currently have 3 products on our product portfolio. 1 is soon to be coming out, so 2 currently out on the market right now, and 1 soon to come that I'll talk about here in a little bit. But the first one we're going to mainly talk about is DuraCore. So this might go a little bit more in depth than what you guys are familiar with, but for Jonathan, this might apply to him a little bit. You can see that Corteva AgriScience, all of our products here on the right, these are all the name brand products that you would see on the shelves. Corteva has very much dominated the growth regulator area, family of actives or So when we look at our actives, this is the family that they all group into. And group 4 is much of what you're going to find in your range and pasture market. And so these are synthetic auxins and growth regulators, and they are just like what they sound. So when these actives bind to the auxin receptors within the plant, it literally makes it metabolize and outgrow itself. It kicks it into high gear, and that's why how the plant eventually dies is that it just grows itself until it runs out of energy. So what we have is, and many of you are probably familiar with Milestone in the past, aminopyrrolate and the pyridine, but we have a brand new, which is our Rinskor, which is our arlapiclinate here. So they still fall under the synthetic auxin group 4, but Rinskor is a brand new, which is also in Duracor. So when we look at Rinskor, it acts a lot like a 2,4-D. Really, they asked, why can't we just group Rinskor into the phenoxy, which is our 2,4-D? Well, there's a lot of different characteristics that change that. And so when we dig into it, the Rinskor binds to a different site within the plant. And so within that new binding site within the plant, we've come out with a less resistant to the plants become less resistant to herbicides as we gradually keep continuing to change where those synthetic auxin bind. So what's the difference between, Milestone or Duracor? Why do we have the Rinskor? Is Duracor has low and flexible use rates. We are between 16 and 20 ounces per acre rate control for most of our weeds. And I'll go through all the weeds, noxious weeds that we can find here in the county and give you the recommendations on those. But we're at low and flexible use rates between 16 and 20 ounces, and it's a non-restricted product. So Duracor does not contain 2,4-D and it does not contain dicamba. And for that reason, we get also many new options out of that. So we have a flexible reseeding option. So if we're in a fire restoration area, we want to be able to drill or broadcast reseeding. So with Duracor, you're able to do we have a 45-day interval post-application on reseeding, whether that be broadcast or drill. And then you can come back in with either tall fescue, orchard grass, pear millet, annual ryegrass, or timothy. And so as you can see, this is a picture after a fire where they're coming in and doing a broadcast reseeding with a helicopter. Other application methods, probably most of you guys in here are familiar or would be doing a ground or have someone do a ground application for you. But we can also do aerial applications, which is most of what I find out in western Kansas. I have many aerial applicators that I work with that will apply Duracor on pastures and rangeland for the ranchers. Labeled use sites, so there are quite a few labeled use sites for Duracor. We have rangeland, permanent grass pastures or hay acres, conservation, CRP, wildlife management areas. This is labeled in the San Luis Valley. That's something new that we weren't able to have with Milestone. And then we also have supplemental labeling for right-of-ways. So this is where you'll see in the back I brought some goodies for High Noon. So High Noon is the exact same product as Duracor, but it has more labeled use sites. So High Noon will be labeled for your open spaces, your parks and wildlife, more of your IVM bare ground situations. That's where High Noon is going to be labeled. But High Noon is the essentially exact same product chemistry as Duracor. It's just going to have more labeled use sites. And I will keep Jonathan. We finally just got federal registration for High Noon, so Jonathan will be up to date on all of that as it keeps coming, so you can reach out to him and he'll be able to point you in the right direction there. So how does Duracor compare to Milestone? Milestone is actually in Duracor. So when we talk about Duracor, Duracor is made up of two active ingredients. It's Milestone, which is aminopyrrolate, and then it's Rinskor, which is our new active ingredient. So if you were traditionally using 5 ounces of Milestone in the past, your acid equivalent for what is in 5 ounces of Milestone is actually in 16 ounces of Duracor. So if you like the 5 ounce rate of Milestone, you're going to be at the 16 ounce rate of Duracor, and you're getting an additional active. So I like to say you're getting 2 products for the price of 1 at this point. And then you have, if you liked your 7 ounce rate of Milestone, then you're going to be at a 20 ounce rate of Duracor. Something else that we can compare to, traditionally in the past, a lot of people have done just Milestone by itself and then thrown in 2,4-D, but there's a peace of mind that we have with DuraCore. So DuraCore is safe on grass, and it's low odor. In these Douglas County, you can see a lot of people. I am very familiar with driving down the road and I see an applicator spraying, and I can know right away whether or not he's spraying 2,4-D because I can smell it in my vehicle. And I'm sure having out of sight, out of mind herbicides in these areas where people are constantly, watching the news, herbicides, chemicals, they're in the public's eye at the moment. And so having something that can be quiet and get in and get out and still get the job done at this point is very valuable for our industry. So having a low odor formulation and having a low volatility formulation, meaning if I spray it, it's not going to pick up and move a couple days later. So with volatility, when we spray a herbicide and it becomes, I believe it's low humidity, high temperature, those are the variants that cause the highest risk for volatility. And this is a perfect prime, Colorado is a prime state for that, low humidity, high temperatures. And so if we can eliminate that volatility issue as well with our herbicides, we're keeping it out of the public's eye and getting in and getting what we need to get done. DuraCore is also has no grazing restrictions for any class of livestock. So I get a lot of questions. I have 4 alpacas on 10 acres and I want to spray for some weeds. You're good to go. You do not have to worry about taking your alpacas off or whatever, a donkey, whatever you might have. You don't have to worry about it. And then DuraCore, like I said, is a combination of 2 reduced risk herbicides, which is aminopyrrolid or Milestone. You're probably familiar with the Milestone trade name, and Rinskor Active. So getting into some field trial results, Corteva AgriScience, we're very blessed to have a field scientist dedicated to the Western District that I'm in, and Will Hattler does a lot of our studies for us. And so I actually have trials out here in Fort Collins, and then he also does a lot up in Idaho around Boise, which is where he lives. So one of the first ones I want to talk about, Russian knapweed, non-native, a little background on it, non-native perennial form in the aster family, was accidentally introduced in the U.S. through alfalfa seed in the late 1800s and can form dense monocultures with no agriculture or ecological value. So a very noxious weed in this area. You can see here on the right is untreated, what it looks like of Russian knapweed 1 year. This would be 1 year after treatment. If we look at the right, this would be an untreated area, and then if we look at the left, DuraCore at 20 ounces, that's what it looks like. These were put out by Phil Westra with Colorado State University. Then we look at another one. This is 2 years after treatment. So if we look at the right, that would be untreated. And then when we look at the left, that would be treated with 20 fluid ounces. And we're looking at 2 years after treatment. Common mullein. Not one, I don't think you had mentioned this one, but one just to have on here because I see quite a bit of it. I was not familiar with mullein when I first moved out west, and I was always asked, what are those spear-looking things out in the rangeland when I was driving through eastern Colorado? But it's mullein. So non-native biennial ground broadcast application is DuraCore at 20 fluid ounces with MSO. So if you guys are doing your own spraying, we want to make sure we have a surfactant. If not, if you're having Jonathan or someone within the county or someone else, make sure they're adding in a surfactant. So that's what that methylated seed oil MSO term there is. You can go at spring or fall. I've heard both application timings. I've had a lot of work done up in Scottsbluff, Nebraska, and many of the aerial applicators up there say they'd rather go with a fall application. I hear many people say spring. Whichever one you decide, the rosette, which is where it's at, this is considered the rosette stage here, and then that's before it starts bolting out the middle where we get the tall spear and where it flowers. At that point, when it starts coming out the middle, you're too late. So I would wait then for the next interval, which would be, so if we're in spring, if you don't make your spring application, then I'd wait till fall. You don't want to spray it when it's still flowering because you're just not going to get control. So best timing is at this rosette stage, so when I mention that term. And this is some trial work. This was done in Boulder, Colorado, so you can see 1 year after treatment with untreated on mullein versus treated. If we're in heavy, dense populations like this too, I always recommend throwing in a 1/2 ounce Escort. Is probably not a bad idea either. Canada thistle. So this applies to musk bull scotch as well. So I'll just group those into this. Non-native. So Canada thistle, non-native, perennial are musk bull scotch. Those are biennials. But I want to address Canada thistle the most here is Duracor between 18 to 20 ounces. So then I also show our surfactant, non-ionic surfactant, 1 quart per 100 gallons. Best timing again for this application is at the rosette stage. And then you can see the others that fall under this recommendation would be musk thistle, bull, or scotch. So this is a graph showing Duracor 16 ounces versus Duracor 20. You can see the end result, the orange would be a year after treatment. You can see the end result is pretty much the same, but if you're looking for a quicker 27 days after treatments in the blue, you can see that the 20 fluid ounces obviously gives it a little bit more oomph. But either way, you can go between 16 and 20 and still get good results 1 year after treatment. I always like to kind of go just right in the middle at 18 is usually a good application. So getting into leafy spurge, in the past, I've always recommended just high rates of Tordon, which if anyone's familiar with Tordon 22K or picloram, it can scorch grasses as well. So you may be getting rid of your leafy spurge, but you're probably going to get rid of all the grass around it as well. And grass is valuable to the ranchers in the area, and especially when we're talking about desirable grasses, even in these fire settings, we need those. And so we have been conducting now a Sweet 16 mix. Our rep, Claire Volk, she covers Montana, Wyoming, and the Western Dakotas, and she came up with this name. It's not trademarked yet, but I do like it. So we're doing 16 ounces of Duracor, 16 ounces of Tordon, and 16 ounces of Freelex. So think of a pint, a pint, a pint, or you could say a Sweet 16 mix of those 3 herbicides. So you've got your Duracor, your picloram, which is in Tordon, and then 2,4-D, which is in Freelex. And you can go with the summer-fall application on that as well. So this is some trial work. This was done in Du Bois, Idaho. So you can see 1 year after treatment, this would be leafy spurge untreated versus leafy spurge treated. And then you can see on the right and left here, those are pretty much your check areas where the herbicide wasn't applied. So then we're getting into this, I would say, Jonathan saw this site. This is up in Fort Collins. I think it's funny because I listen to a lot of distribution, I listen to a lot of companies, chemical companies talk, and anyone who talks about leafy spurge has visited this site. I think there's only one site like this in the whole U.S., and it's in Fort Collins, because you can see we call it the Sea of Spurge. It's just all leafy spurge, and then you can see where people's plots are throughout. So this whole square here, where you can see the kind of the dot going, this is all part of our plot, but this would be untreated here. I would call this absolutely worst case scenario. If you let it get this bad, I mean, we're really need to readdress what our stewardship methods are. But this is after the Sweet 16 mix. So this is only 1 year after treatment. So all this brown, this is all the skeletons. Now granted, if we get up and close and personal, there's still actively growing some leafy spurge in here. This is not 100% kill. I would say we're only about 70% here. So my best recommendation is to go back in. We actually did. I'll mention here at the end, I'm going to be having the Corteva Rocky Mountain plot tour again this summer. And so what we did on these back parts of the plot is we did a 2nd year application. So we can go back in and see. Now the key things to note here, look at the grass still coming up. We still have good green desirable grass coming in behind the spurge. So we're not going in, so like if typically we would have probably gone in with at least a quart of Tordon, and we would not see this grass response either. Another product that's been very traditionally used for spurge, which many people think of as this almost the silver bullet for spurge, is Method. And Method is a great product, but if we go back in a 2nd year with 8 ounces of Method, we are not going to have this grass response either. So that's why when we come back in with Duracor, we're going to still have good grass response and release and still get good control of our spurge. Hoary cress or white top, non-native perennial. Good application is Duracor by itself, between 70 and 80% control. I would not, if I were to give you my best application, I would say go out with Duracor at 20 ounces per acre with half ounce to an ounce of Escort. These are just some other ones. This is actually Will Hattler here, our IFS specialist, putting out some plots. And you can see I just threw up some other weeds that you guys might run into with the rates recommendations on those. Does anyone have any key noxious weeds that I did not list up here? We're going to get to cheatgrass in a minute, but any noxious broadleaf weeds that I didn't address? Houndstone? Yes. So we've been doing, I wish I would have put that up there. Duracor, 16 ounces. And then we have Pasture Guard. It's a combination of triclopyr and fluroxypyr, and we do that at a pint as well. So a pint Pasture Guard and a pint Duracor. And you can do that later spring application when the plant's actively growing. The biggest thing here for any of these applications is if the plant is under drought stress, just wait, sit back. I mean, I'd love to sell you guys chemical, but your most expensive application is your second application, and that's when I get the calls, and I don't want those. So let's, if we're in very drought stress conditions, usually in the spring we've got things up and going and growing, but if we're waiting into the summer and sometimes fall, we kind of start battling that as well. Another one I forgot. I thought I would address scrub oak or gamble oak when we get into, I don't know if you guys have a lot of it here, but when I get down into southern Colorado, I come across quite a bit of that. Unfortunately, there is no really good, there's nothing great I can tell you that's going to attack this besides a lot of labor. So your best chance for success is a cut stump treatment, which is where you have to cut at the stump. You literally have to cut it off, and then you come in and treat the stump area. So we would do a solution mix of 15% Garlon 4 Ultra and 85% basil bark oil. That's going to be your best chance for success. If you're up to it and want to go at a foliar and a rangeland setting, you can go at 2 quarts Garlon 4 Ultra with 2 quarts Tordon, but you're only going to get suppression at best. You're not going to get good control, and you're going to have to do this multiple years. But this is the one that I get questions on, especially, like I said, down in southern Colorado, because this is also one of those ladder fuels that we find in fires. So getting into the last one here, we're going to talk about cheatgrass. I actually took this picture up in Scotts Bluff. You can see this picture would be great, but you can see this fine line here. This is all cheatgrass in the back. That is, this is probably, I guess I took this in July, so it's already browned out and become non-palatable. And this right here is prime example of just fire real estate that would just come blazing through there, especially with the winds that we have. So a little background on cheatgrass, non-native, winter annual grass. What I would be willing to argue it's one of the most competitive non-natives in the western U.S. Thrives in arid, cool climates, so we're prime, again, western U.S. is prime real estate for it. And can produce, an individual plant can produce up to 500 seeds per year, and those seeds then can stay viable in the ground for 3 to 5 years, and they stay shallow in the surface. So when I mention winter annual grasses, they are usually your first ones to green up in the spring, and then they'll be germinating in the fall. So there's a few ways to control cheatgrass. I'm not just going to give you the herbicide method. There are, if you do have cattle, you can graze cheatgrass. They've done tests that say when it's still in the green, when it's before it's seeded out, you can actually get 10 to 17% crude protein from it. But as soon as it starts to, the seed starts to start in, that plant drops in palatability very quickly. So if you do practice grazing rotation. You can rotational graze it, but it's still a lot of intensive work. The only time I would even remotely recommend this is if you have a small patch of it that you need to manage, and you can do like an intensive grazing on that, or like a mob grazing, which is the high intensity, low frequency system. Another method that you see probably a lot more on roadside is a mechanical control method. Granted, you can mow before seed production, but you have to keep doing that every 2 to 3 weeks. And with the price of fuel or diesel and the manpower that we lack right now, to actually go out and do that every 2 to 3 weeks is a lot. Unless we have another infield scientist who covers the eastern part of the U.S., and he always is cracking jokes, and he jokes, I can relate to this actually because my dad is one of them. But they just love to go out and sit on their tractor, because that's the only way you can legally drink and drive is on your mower in your pasture. So I think there's just some satisfaction of going out and mowing your pastures, which I try to tell you not to do, but there is some satisfaction into it, I guess. So if you like to mow your pastures, I guess this method is good for you. But mowing is usually about as effective as applying glyphosate, which is a chemical mowing option, but again, you have to keep coming back in. And both of these control methods are commonly used more on roadside, because there's no way you could do this in a rangeland setting. So before I get into the chemical piece of it, I want you guys to think about some pieces of the puzzle to remember. So how much can you leave behind and still have desirable grass? How many years in a row should we be treating? And can we handle broadleaves and grasses separately? The biggest thing here to take away is we cannot just focus on one. We cannot just focus on broadleaves. We cannot just focus on grasses. We cannot do them separately. For a complete restoration fire prevention program, we have to address the broadleaves and the grasses together. Another thing to think about is that we can't just come in with one treatment and expect that to answer all the problems. We have to think about, are we going to need multiple treatments? Are we going to need to come back in 2 or 3 years? And then we also get into what's the cost of doing that? What are we getting done? And then what are we leaving behind? Because that's the other key thing. If we talk about that our rangelands, they're sick, we want generations to come to be able to use these lands. We have to be thinking about tomorrow and not today. And so what can we leave behind for the future generations and still have healthy rangelands? So this is a great example of when you only focus on one problem, you turn your back on another. So you'll see here, this was an application done of Plateau at 8 fluid ounces. So Plateau, if you're not familiar with it, it is a product commonly used to get grass out of grass. Good product, but that's its key focus is grass out of grass. And you can see here, this is Canada thistle that just exploded. There's no more cheatgrass. It got rid of the cheatgrass, what it was supposed to do, but you can just see the Canada thistle that encroached in on that area where the cheatgrass then left. So you can see we have milestone, 7 ounces of milestone up here. You can see the control that if this was mixed with a milestone or a Duracor or soon to be high noon, you would have gotten control of that Canada thistle or that Russian knapweed. And then you can see the control that we have with that 1 year after treatment. So the best control method is chemical. Best practices for treat grass to control in broad areas as a part of a complete restoration program. So again, we're focusing on those noxious broadleaves and the cheatgrass. Fall is preferred season to apply herbicide on cheatgrass post germination for this recommendation, while offering the greatest chance then for your reseeding success. So the recommendation that I would offer on cheatgrass is milestone at 5 ounces. Plus Plateau at 6 ounces. So you're probably thinking, well, why would she recommend milestone over Duracor if Duracor has milestone in it? And it really gets down to our labeling, where we have to use milestone in these instances where we're going to be wanting to do this application. Eventually, when we get high noon, then we can sub high noon. But right now, we'll be at milestone 5 ounces and Plateau at 6. So then you're probably thinking, well, you just told me not to use Plateau. Well, no, we still want Plateau because that is going to be our heavy lifter for grass out of grass. So that's where it's going to be attacking the seed in the ground, the cheatgrass. But then we also need that milestone in there for the broadleaves that may come up after it. So this is end of October 2019 applied. This was done in Idaho by Trent Brusso, one of our other reps. This is when they applied it. So this was in October 2019. This is what it looked like. They did milestone 5 ounces plus plateau at 6 ounces. And this is what it looked like when they came back July 2021. So this is 2 years after treatment. So you can see the green grass and see the absence. We're going to do a modified in here, zoom in. So when we talk about those surface fuels, this is prime example here. So this is good grass coming up. And then you can see over in here, this is all that cheatgrass. So a flame would naturally flame up through here. But see, this is a barrier here where if we don't have those surface fuels, this is bare ground. This is not, fires do not like this. So they want this. So if we can prevent this cheatgrass from weeding in, no pun intended there, weeding in between there, we can have the bare ground, which is what we want, the absence of surface fuels. So this is another zoom out of a 2 year after treatment, milestone 5 ounces. So treated versus untreated. And another key thing, I don't know if you can see it as much in this picture. I know there's another one coming up here, but this application also allows your release of desirable forbs and for your pollinators and sage grouse. Yes. So I know I get a lot of questions on that as well. And I think this isn't it yet either, but this is, we have an applicator, like I said, that a lot of these were done up in Idaho and Montana, but you can see again here, this was untreated, where you can see the cheatgrass coming in, encroaching in, and then you can see here where it's bare in between there. I don't know, I think this one's a good one. This is in the Salmon River break, so you can see that there's no knapweed or cheatgrass, but I think I had to kind of crop the picture, but there were some forbs around spotted in there. And again, this would, to me, this is post, you can see a post-fire where they've come back in and applied, and this is, to me, a healthy rangeland. When we can see the pollinators and we can see the good grass, perennial grass coming in, and then getting rid of those annuals. So the benefits to this recommendation, there's no grazing restriction. So if we are grazing cattle, we don't have to worry about that. We have broad spectrum use sites, so that's why we're using the milestone, so we can do this in our right-of-ways, a Rangeland, Pasture, roadside, anything like that. And then our average cost per acre, depending, is between $18 and $24. Any questions?
All right, I do have some questions. The first one would be for Katie. How long do areas have to be chemically treated for unwanted plants to be eradicated, that we can be sure they won't grow back?
Sure. She's coming up.
Great, thank you.
Yes, so good question. There is no, a lot of it depends on the weed. It also depends on what's already living there. So if we're in a bare ground site and you're wanting it, a lot of it is what's your end goal. So if we're in a bare ground site and when I say bare ground, it's in an area that you might see next to a culvert or in a utility area where we're going to keep it bare and we want no weeds, you're going to have to come back and usually treat every year, every 2 years. If we're in a situation where rangeland, like what we've been talking about here, if you have good establishment of perennial grasses and weeds, you should be able to come in and treat, and then come in and treat less often. A lot of it depends on what your goal is, what you already have established there as far as good forage and desirables, and then it also gets down into what are the noxious weeds. Are they annuals? Are they biennials, where they come, they have 2 year cycle, and then we have to look at the viability of the plant seed. So for using mullein, for instance, the seed can actually stay viable in the ground for up to 10 years. So even though that seed may be in the ground, you may not see it show its light till 10 years later. So getting control, again, it depends on what your end goal is, what situation you're in, what weeds are we going after, and then it also depends on what desirables do we have there to fill in its place once we get rid of those weeds. So all of those factors go into play. So I can't give you a straight answer that, oh, you're only going to have to treat for 1 year or 5 years and be done. A lot of it depends on what you have to fill in and take its place. So would you, Jonathan, say anything different to that?
Well, in addition, depends on what type of weed you're fighting. If you're fighting Canada thistle, you're fighting bindweed, you're fighting leafy spurge or yellow toad flax, you're going to have roots coming back from the plant. I mean, it'll shoot up new stalks. Even if you were using Rejuvera, which we've tried, that Rejuvera only takes care of seedlings. So if there's anything coming back from the roots, it's going to come back from the roots. So any of those weeds, you're going to have to treat them annually, probably for 5 years in a row, and then reevaluate.
Good info. Thank you. One more for Katie. Do we have to worry about our pets or kids being in the areas that we're treating for weeds?
It definitely depends on the herbicide that you're using. So usually a good rule of thumb is always check the labeling. I don't know. Usually they'll have on there like the caution words or signal words that the applicators have to use, and then they have to go through. So we do have we'll use Tordon, for instance, that is a restricted use pesticide. So you have to have certain credits to use it. But a lot of it gets down to what chemical you're using. Most stuff you can buy over the counter. You shouldn't have to worry about spraying around anyone. Obviously, you don't want to ingest it, but it will say on the labels what equipment you need to have on, safety goggles, or what precautions you need to have as far as safety terms. And then as far as your animals or different things, again, it really just depends on the herbicides. But I would say because of the spotlight that is on chemicals now, these herbicides that we're using, I would say, for instance, let's use Duracor. If we look at the actual acid equivalent of how much actual chemical is in the bottle, it's very minimal. Almost all of what you're seeing in a chemical jug is actually water. And so even the rinse core, if you hold 12 paper clips in your hand, that's the weight of how much actual active ingredients in a 20-ounce rate of Duracor. So the actual herbicide chemical is so minimal now. But again, just have to check the label. Depending on what herbicide you're using or chemical you're using will tell you what to be used around, what you can't use, if it is a restricted use pesticide or anything like that. So again, it would just depend on what specific herbicide you're talking about. But I would say most herbicides you can buy over the counter. They wouldn't be selling them over the counter if there was similar with drugs you buy over the counter, Tylenol. I mean, they're not going to let you go use those over the counter if there was an increased something that could go wrong.